The light burned all night in the empty cottage. A Miss Marple mystery. Welcome, dear listeners. There is a particular kind of dread that comes not from noise, but from stillness. A light burning in a room where no one should be. A door that was closed and is now open. A name spoken at dinner that makes three people set down their forks at the same moment. Tonight's story begins on a Friday afternoon. Gravel under tires. A house full of old money and older secrets. Guests who have arrived with smiles and suitcases, and something else, something they did not declare at the door. By Saturday morning, one of them will be dead. Before we go any further, I would like to know who is here with me tonight. Are you tucked in somewhere warm, the day finally done? Perhaps you are on a night shift, a quiet moment stolen between tasks, retired with a pot of something hot nearby. Or maybe your hands are busy, ironing, cooking, simply resting, while your mind wanders somewhere it can breathe. Tell me below. I read every comment. Tonight's story is inspired by the world of Agatha Christie and Miss Marple. No rights claimed, only love for the genre. Now, the house is at the end of a long lane. The snow has just begun, and somewhere inside, a light is burning in a room that was supposed to be empty. Shall we go in? Chapter 1. Arrivals. The gravel drive at Ashworth Hall ran for nearly a quarter-mile from the iron gates to the front door, and whoever had laid it down had used far too much of it. Every car that came up on Friday afternoon announced itself with a long, grinding crunch that carried through the library windows and into the rooms above. Mrs. Constance Ashworth heard the first car at 2:30 and did not go to the window. She was 61, thin in the way that made people say she must have been beautiful once, and she had run this house for 34 years. She knew the sound of every engine that belonged here and many that did not. The first car was her son Gerald's. She could tell by the way he touched the accelerator twice at the bottom of the rise, a habit he'd had since he learned to drive on this very lane. Gerald was 40 now and still did it. She folded the letter she had been reading and placed it in the left-hand drawer of the writing desk. Then she went down to greet him. Gerald Ashworth came through the front door ahead of his wife, which told Constance everything she needed to know about the current state of their marriage. He was tall, dark at the temples now, wearing a coat that had cost more than the quarterly heating bill. His wife Miriam followed 3 steps behind, pulling off her gloves 1 finger at a time. Miriam was pleasant, careful, and had learned in 12 years of marriage to enter rooms slightly after her husband. "Mother," Gerald kissed her cheek. "You look well." "I am perfectly well," Constance said. "The East Wing bedroom is ready for you." "Miriam, your usual room." Miriam smiled and said nothing. She had her own room at Ashworth Hall. She had had it since the 3rd year of the marriage, when something happened that neither of them ever spoke about in front of anyone. The second car arrived at 3, a hired motor, which meant Philip. Philip Ashworth was Gerald's younger brother, 36, and had not owned a car since his divorce. He came up the steps with 2 badly packed bags and a bottle of wine that he had clearly bought at the village petrol station. "The prodigal," he said, arms wide. "You were here at Christmas," Constance said. 3 months is long enough for a prodigal." He kissed her twice and went past her into the hall, looking at everything the way people look at a place they expect to be sold soon. The third arrival was the one that made the butler, Hewson, come to find Constance in the drawing room at 3:30. "Miss Fellows has arrived, ma'am," he said, "with a guest." "A guest?" Constance set down her cup. "Miss Fellows did not mention a guest." "No, ma'am. She says it was arranged late. A Miss Marple. She describes her as an old school friend." Constance considered this. Diana Fellows was 43, the daughter of the solicitor who had handled Ashworth affairs for 2 generations. She had been invited this weekend because she was the executor of the late Mr. Ashworth's will, and because the family had agreed, in writing, to hear the full terms of it together. If Diana had brought someone, Diana had a reason. "Show them both in," Constance said. Diana Fellows was a large, competent-looking woman with short grey hair and the steady eyes of someone who read documents for a living. Beside her, making the drawing room seem briefly larger by contrast, was a small, white-haired woman in a coat of impractical blue wool, carrying a bag from which the end of a knitting needle protruded. She looked at the room with the mild, interested expression of someone who had walked into a good deal of rooms in her time and intended to be comfortable in this one. "Mrs. Ashworth," Diana said, "this is Miss Jane Marple. We were at school together, before your time. I hope you don't mind. She happened to be visiting the village, and I thought, at a weekend like this, company of a certain sort might be a comfort." "A comfort," Constance repeated. "To me, I mean," Diana said, which was not what she had meant at all. Miss Marple shook Constance's hand. Her grip was dry and firm. "What a lovely house," she said. "Those are Regency windows in the library, aren't they? My nephew Raymond has a friend whose grandmother had something very similar. The drafts were terrible, of course." "They are," Constance said, despite herself. "Terrible in January." By 5 o'clock, all the guests had arrived. The last was a man named Hugo Crane, 48, broad across the shoulders, with the kind of sunburn that stays in the lines of a face long after the holiday is over. Hugo had been in business with the late Mr. Ashworth for nearly 15 years. He said he had come to pay his respects to the family. He said it looking at Constance and then, very briefly, at the closed library door. He brought no wife, he had never had one. At 6, Hewson rang the bell for sherry, and they gathered in the drawing room, 8 of them around a fire that Hewson had built too large and too hot, the way he always did when he was anxious. The snow that had threatened all afternoon began, very quietly, against the window. Nobody looked at the library door except Hugo Crane. Nobody except Miss Marple noticed him doing it. Chapter 2. Dinner. Hewson had set the table for 8 and placed the candles in the silver holders that came out 4 times a year. The centerpiece was a bowl of hothouse flowers that Mrs. Partridge, the cook, had driven to Brentford to collect on Thursday. Everything was done correctly. Everything smelled of effort. They sat, Constance at the head, Gerald to her right, Miriam beside Gerald. Philip took the far end, which he always did, because he liked to watch the table. Hugo Crane was placed between Diana Fellows and an empty chair. Miss Marple sat opposite Hugo, next to Miriam, and unfolded her napkin with the careful attention of someone who intended to stay a while. The empty chair was for a name nobody had mentioned yet. "Is someone else expected?" Philip asked, nodding at it. "Roger Fell," Constance said. "He telephoned this afternoon. His train was delayed." "Roger Fell," Philip repeated, in a tone that made Miriam look at her plate. Gerald refilled his wineglass. "He has every right to be here, Philip. He was father's partner for 8 years. The will mentions him." "The will mentions a good many people," Philip said, pleasantly. "That's rather why we're all here, isn't it?" The soup came, a brown Windsor, that Mrs. Partridge made too thick and too earnest. They ate. The fire was too warm. Somebody had opened a window slightly in the hall, and cold air came under the dining room door. Hugo Crane ate without speaking for the first course, and the second. He drank steadily, but not excessively. He watched, in the way that men who spend their lives watching deals watch rooms, looking at faces when the faces thought they were looking at something else. He was watching Constance. Constance, for her part, was watching nobody. She sat at the head of the table, with the precise bearing of a woman who has been sitting at the head of tables since before any of these people were old enough to have opinions, and she answered questions and managed the silences with the kind of quiet authority that nobody argues with directly. Miss Marple ate her soup and listened. She asked Miriam about the drive down. She asked Diana about the village church, which she said she had noticed on the way in. And was that Saxon work above the door? Diana said she believed so. Miss Marple said how interesting. Her friend Mrs. Bantry had known a vicar once who had spent 3 years documenting exactly that type of stonework, and what a different world it had been then. Nobody thought this was particularly significant. At 8:30, there were headlights in the drive. Roger Fell came in with cold air and apologies. He was 55, compact, quick-moving, with a salesman's handshake and a solicitor's eyes. He sat in the empty chair and accepted wine and said he hoped he hadn't held things up. The roads were something terrible past Swindon. He said this to the table generally. His eyes went to Constance first, and then to Hugo Crane, and something passed between him and Hugo. Not a smile, not a nod, something smaller than either. And then Roger picked up his fork and began to eat as if he were perfectly comfortable, which he clearly was not. Philip watched this. Miriam watched Philip watching this. Gerald watched neither of them and drank his 3rd glass of wine. The conversation moved, as it does at such tables, through subjects that nobody particularly cared about. The weather, the road from London, whether the East Wood had recovered from the storm last autumn. Philip mentioned, with just enough casualness to make it a remark rather than a question, that he had heard the Ashworth estate had received an offer. A developer, he'd been told. Constance said she was not aware of any offer. Gerald said the estate was not being sold. Hugo Crane looked at the centrepiece. Roger Fell said, "Well, these things take time to work through properly," and smiled at nobody in particular. Later, when she had more to work with, Miss Marple would return to that smile. It had been the wrong shape for the sentence it was attached to. Not a reassuring smile, something closer to the expression a man wears when he knows the outcome of a thing and is waiting for everyone else to catch up. The pudding came. The decanter went around. Philip told a story about a hotel in Lisbon that made Gerald laugh for the first time that evening. At 10:15, Roger Fell excused himself early, citing the journey. He took his wineglass with him to the door and then seemed to remember it and set it on the sideboard. Nobody thought this was significant either. At 11, Hewson locked the front door and put the chain on. The snow was coming harder. He checked the drawing-room windows and the library, which was where he always finished, and where he found, on the floor by the writing desk, a small folded piece of paper. He picked it up. He did not open it. He placed it on the silver letter tray on the hall table, where the Morning Post usually lived, and went to bed. He was the only person in the house who slept well that night. Chapter 3. The Body. At 7:20 on Saturday morning, the housemaid Ellen found Roger Fell. She had gone to the library to lay the fire. This was her first task every morning, the library before the dining room before the drawing room, working from one end of the ground floor to the other. She was 16 and had been at Ashworth Hall for 8 months, and she had found the work perfectly ordinary until Saturday. The library door was not fully closed. This was unusual because Hewson locked it at night and the key hung on his ring. Ellen pushed it open with one finger, saw what was on the floor, and went immediately to find Hewson without touching anything, which showed a considerable presence of mind. Roger Fell was lying on his back between the writing desk and the window. He had fallen from the chair. The chair was on its side, and his wineglass was on the desk, empty, the stem cracked as though caught by a passing hand. He was fully dressed, still in his dinner clothes. He had been dead for several hours. His face was the colour and stillness of something no longer in use. Hewson came, looked, and went upstairs to Mrs. Ashworth. By 8 o'clock the house was awake. By 8:30 the telephone had been tried and found dead. The line had come down in the night, somewhere between the hall and the junction box at the bottom of the lane. By 9, Gerald had been out in the snow and returned with the news that the lane was impassable, adrift 3 feet deep at the lower gate, and the bridge over the mill stream invisible under what had come down in the night. They were alone. Dr. Hargreaves, who lived in the village, could not be reached. Sergeant Price at the village police station could not be reached. Nobody could be reached. Philip drove his hire car to the bottom of the lane, got it sideways in the drift, and had to be pulled out by Hewson with a length of rope. They gathered in the drawing room at 10, all of them except Roger Fell, who was still in the library, the door now locked, the key in Hewson's pocket. Fell, Gerald said, looking at the fire, had a heart condition. He mentioned it at the last board meeting. He refused the operation. This is not. It is very sad, but it is not. There is no reason to think. Gerald, Diana said. He was 55 and appeared to be in good health at dinner last night. People appear in good health and then… Gerald. Philip was sitting apart, at the window, watching the snow. He had a cup of coffee that had gone cold. The question, he said, without turning around, is what he was doing in the library, at midnight, in his dinner jacket. Nobody answered this. Miss Marple, who had been sitting in the corner chair with her knitting, said, "Was the library usually unlocked at night?" "No," Hewson said. He was standing near the door, straight-backed, as he stood near all doors. "I lock it at 11. The key does not leave my ring." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "Mr. Fell was inside." "Yes," Hewson said, "with the door pulled to but not locked." "Yes, so someone used the key," admitted Mr. Fell, "and returned the key to your ring before morning." She turned a row without looking up. "Or someone was already inside when you locked up, which means they were hiding inside and then left by another means." The room was very quiet. The fire made its ordinary sounds. "There is a French window," Constance said, from her chair by the cold window. She had not moved since she sat down. "In the library. It opens onto the terrace." "Yes," Miss Marple said, "I rather thought there might be." Hugo Crane, who had not spoken since entering the room, said, "Are you suggesting this was not natural causes?" "I am not suggesting anything," Miss Marple said pleasantly. "I am simply finding out what the rooms are like. I'm afraid I have that habit. My friends find it tiresome." She went back to her knitting. Nobody found it tiresome. They found it, each of them in their different ways, rather alarming. Chapter 4. Saturday afternoon. The snow stopped at midday, and then started again at 2, as if it had only paused to think. By 3 the garden was a single, undifferentiated white, the lawns and the ha-ha and the kitchen garden all at the same height and the same colour, and the lane remained invisible. Constance had asked Mrs. Partridge to serve lunch, because that was what you did. You fed people. You kept the house going. The alternative was to sit in rooms and stare at each other, and that was worse. They ate, mostly in silence. Gerald drank more than he ate. Miriam watched him do it without expression. Philip ate everything on his plate with the mechanical thoroughness of a man who knows he needs to keep his strength up for something. Diana Fellows, after lunch, came to find Miss Marple in the small sitting room off the hallway, where Miss Marple had established herself with her knitting bag and a view of the hall. "You're not just a school friend," Diana said, sitting down without being invited. "I mean, we were at school together, that's true. But you know things about this sort of situation." "I know a very great number of things about a very great number of situations," Miss Marple said. "Village life is educational in ways that people don't always appreciate. Roger Fell did not die of a heart attack." "No," Miss Marple said. "I don't believe he did." "What do I do with that belief?" "Nothing yet. You are the executor of a will. You are in a house with 7 other people, no telephone and no road. The wisest thing an executor can do in this situation is observe and remember and wait for the road to clear. The police will come when they can come." Diana looked at her for a moment. "You're frightened." "I am cautious," Miss Marple said. "There is someone in this house who has killed a man and is currently watching the rest of us to see who knows what. A frightened killer is a dangerous thing. The right response to a frightened killer is to appear to know nothing." "And do you know something?" Miss Marple looked at her knitting. "I know that Roger Fell's wineglass was on the writing desk. He had carried it with him from dinner. He set it down at the writing desk. which means he sat at the writing desk. He was there to read something, or to take something, or to leave something. I know that something happened to him between when he sat down and when he fell. I know that the fall came after. There was nothing on his hands, no defensive marks at all, which means he didn't try to catch himself. He was already gone when he went over. The wine, Diana said. Perhaps. I would very much like to know who refilled his glass after dinner. I noticed the glass go around twice at the table. After that, I lost track. We had all moved about. She turned another row. Mrs. Ashworth, Mr. Crane, and your Mr. Fell all spent time near the decanter between 9:30 and 10. I was talking to Miriam about her garden in Wiltshire, which is a perfectly real garden and a perfectly real conversation, but not the conversation I wanted to be having. You wished you'd watched them instead. I wished I had eyes in two directions, Miss Marple said. I have made that wish before. She sent Diana away with a suggestion to be kind to Hewson, who was having a worse day than any of them, and would, if given the chance, tell her rather a lot about the habits and movements of the household. The rest of Saturday afternoon was conducted under the surface, like all the important things. Hugo Crane spent 2 hours in his room. Philip spent an hour in the library, which Hewson unlocked for him, and came out saying he had found nothing. Gerald telephoned the junction box on foot, in the snow, with tools, and came back having failed to fix the line. Miriam sat with Constance, and they talked about nothing, which they were both very good at. Miss Marple walked in the garden between 2 and 3, in the brief gap when the snow stopped. She walked the terrace. She examined the French window from the outside. She looked at the snow, and at what the snow had covered, and at the 2 sets of footprints that had come to the window from the right, from the direction of the east wing, and gone back the same way. 2 people, one set deep-footed and regular, one lighter, smaller. She stood and looked at them for a long time. When the snow began again, the prints disappeared within 20 minutes. She went in and wrote a few words in a small notebook she kept in her knitting bag, and then she went to find the kitchen, because she wanted to speak to Ellen, the housemaid, and because Mrs. Partridge usually gave her a cup of tea if she appeared around 3 and said something complimentary about the scones. Chapter 5. What Ellen Saw. Ellen was in the scullery peeling potatoes for dinner when Miss Marple arrived. She was 16, with reddish hair and the watchful stillness of a child who has learned that adults stop talking when children appear to be paying attention. She had been paying attention for 16 years without adults noticing. Mrs. Partridge was at the other end of the kitchen with the oven, and the noise of it gave them enough cover that Miss Marple sat down at the scullery table without difficulty. "You are the one who found Mr. Fell," Miss Marple said. Ellen looked at her potato. "Yes'm, that must have been a very frightening thing." "It was. You went directly to Mr. Hewson." "Yes'm, he said I did right." "You did exactly right. You did not touch anything, you said. In the library." "No'm, I didn't go past the door. But you could see, from the door, how he was lying. On his back." Ellen set the potato down and picked up another. "He was very still. You can tell, can't you? When they're—" "Yes," Miss Marple said. "You can tell." They were quiet for a moment. The oven made its sound. "Did you hear anything in the night?" Miss Marple asked. "Not particularly from the library. Anywhere in the house. Any movement? Any voices?" Ellen peeled. She was thinking about whether to say something. Miss Marple recognized the particular quality of that silence. She had met it many times, in village girls who had seen things they weren't sure they were supposed to have seen. "I sleep at the top," Ellen said eventually, "in the attic rooms. There's a window that looks down the back passage. If there's a light in the passage at night, you can see it." And was there, at about 12:30, a light, someone going to the east wing? One person? I thought so. Going, not coming. I didn't see them come back. Could you see who it was? No'm, just the light. A torch, I think, not a candle. It was very steady. She paused. The east wing is where Mr. Crane has his room, and the room next to his, that's used for storage. But this winter, Mrs. Ashworth has been sleeping there too. The master bedroom has damp. She said this last part carefully, without any particular expression. But she had chosen to say it. Miss Marple noted that. "Thank you, Ellen," she said. "You have been very helpful. And you found the body very bravely this morning. It takes courage." Ellen coloured slightly. "It wasn't courage. I just didn't know what else to do." "That," Miss Marple said, "is often what courage is." She left the kitchen with her tea and a piece of shortbread that Mrs. Partridge pressed on her, and went to sit in the small sitting-room and think about east wings and torches at 12:30, and the particular configuration of footprints in the snow outside a French window. Someone had gone to the east wing at midnight. From the east wing it was 40 yards along the outside terrace to the library window. 2 sets of footprints in the snow, one going with them. Or rather, 1 set going and 1 set returning, because the depth was slightly different in each direction. She was fairly sure about that. The library window had been opened from outside. The latch was simple and old. A thin blade. A steady hand. It could be done. Hugo Crane was in the east wing. So was Constance Ashworth. Miss Marple thought about a woman who had been married for 34 years and ran a house with the quiet certainty of someone who had never been questioned in her own home. She thought about a man who had been in business with the late Mr. Ashworth for 15 years and who had been watching the closed library door since the moment he arrived. She thought about a will that none of them had heard yet. She thought about Roger Fell and the shape of his smile when he said that these things take time to work through properly. Then she picked up her knitting again and thought about something else entirely. A situation in St. Mary Mead, 3 years ago, involving a woman named Celia Hargreaves and a cousin from Dorchester, and money that was not quite where it was supposed to be. There are really only so many reasons a person kills. She had nearly finished the left sleeve when Philip Ashworth appeared in the doorway. Chapter 6. Philip's Theory. Philip Ashworth had the look of a man who had been working himself up to something for an hour. He came in, closed the door behind him, pulled the nearest chair to a position that was too close to Miss Marple's to be accidental, and sat down. "I want to tell you something," he said. "I expect you do," Miss Marple said. "You know about this sort of thing. Diana told me. Diana is very free with her assessments." "She's right, isn't she?" He looked at her directly. He had his mother's good bones, but his father's restlessness in the hands. Fell didn't just die. Something happened to him. "What makes you say so?" "Because I know why he was here." He leaned forward. "Not the official reason. Not the will. Not paying respects. The real reason. Roger Fell was here because he knew something about my father's estate. Something that could change what the will says. Or at least, what it means. A document, an agreement, maybe, or a letter, something my father signed in the last year of his life, when he wasn't entirely." He stopped. "When he was not entirely well," Miss Marple said gently. "He had bad months. In the last 2 years, Gerald managed it, dealt with the bank, the solicitors, everything, and I always wondered." He rubbed his face. "I never wondered hard enough. I should have. What do you believe your father signed?" "I don't know exactly. But Hugo Crane has been in business with this family for 15 years. He's been paid, he's been useful, he's been present. And he's here this weekend not to mourn my father. Hugo Crane doesn't mourn people. He's here because whatever document exists, he wants it. Or he wants to make sure nobody else finds it first. And Mr. Fell knew where it was. I think that's why he went to the library. And I think—" He stopped again, differently this time. "I think someone else knew that he knew." Miss Marple set her knitting down. "Philip, this is important. Did you discuss this with Mr. Fell before dinner last night?" He was quiet for a moment too long. "You did," she said. "In the hall. Before Sherry. He was nervous. He said he had something to give me, but not in front of the others. He said later, after they'd gone to bed. Philip looked at the window. I waited up until 1. He never came. Did anyone see you speaking with him in the hall? I don't know. Miriam passed through. Hugo was upstairs, I think. I don't know. Miss Marple looked at him with the particular steadiness that most people in St. Mary Mead had learned over the years to find uncomfortable. Philip, I want you to listen to me carefully. You must not repeat this conversation to anyone in this house. You must not search the library or Mr. Crane's room or anywhere else. You must behave, for the rest of the weekend, exactly as you would behave if you knew nothing, which is to say, like a man who has lost his father and is grieving at an inconvenient time. Can you do that? I'm not very good at inconvenient grief, he said. I tend to make jokes. Then make jokes. Eat your dinner. Don't drink too much. Don't watch Hugo Crane in a way that he notices, and if anything seems wrong, or changed, or out of place, a door, a drawer, a window, you come to me immediately. He nodded slowly. You know who did it. I have a strong suspicion, she said. And in my experience, the distance between a strong suspicion and a certainty is usually filled by the killer themselves. They are never as patient as they think they are. Philip looked at her for a moment. Then he said, My father would have liked you. I'm sure he was an interesting man, Miss Marple said, which was not quite agreement, and picked up her knitting again. Chapter 7. Saturday night, the second incident. Dinner on Saturday was a different table from the one on Friday. Hewson had moved the centerpiece aside because there was no occasion left to celebrate, and the candles were the plain working ones rather than the silver-branched holders. The wine went around once and then stopped. Mrs. Partridge had cooked roast lamb because it was what there was, and nobody commented on it. They sat in the same seats. This is what people do. The instinct to return to the place you occupied yesterday is very strong, especially in a house that has not yet rearranged itself around a death. Hugo Crane ate. He was a man who ate in difficult circumstances because stopping eating was a sign, and he was not in the business of giving signs. Constance Ashworth ate very little, but she was present and upright, and answered questions directly, and did not explain herself to anyone. She had been running this house since her husband's father had handed it to her husband in 1958, and she intended to run it until she couldn't, and the death of a business associate in her library was a difficulty, not a dissolution. Gerald drank carefully, with effort, in the way of a man managing himself. Miriam talked to Philip about something domestic, something designed to fill the silence with neutral sound. Diana was quiet. Miss Marple asked for a little more of the lamb and said it was very well cooked. At 9:30 they rose. In the drawing room, Gerald poured brandy. Philip declined. Hugo said he had some letters to attend to and went upstairs at 10. At 11, the house settled into its nighttime sounds. The boiler, the old joinery in the walls, the windows taking the wind. At 11:40, Miss Marple, who had not been asleep, heard footsteps in the corridor outside her room. She had been given a room on the second floor, the yellow guest room, which had a window facing east and a door that, she had established, did not latch fully unless you lifted the handle as you closed it. She had left it not quite closed on purpose. Through the gap, she could see a portion of the corridor lit by whatever light came from below. A figure passed, moving quickly, carrying something. She was out of bed and at her door in the time it takes to make a decision. The corridor was empty. She listened. From the east wing, further than she could see, there was a sound, a door, then nothing. She did not follow. She went back to her chair by the window and sat in the dark and waited. At 12:15, she heard Gerald shout. She was in the corridor in seconds. Others appeared. Philip from his room, Miriam from hers, Diana at the far end in a dressing gown. Gerald was at the head of the east wing stairs, in shirt sleeves, with the expression of a man who has had a shock and is not sure what kind. "Hugo's room," he said. The door was open. "I saw a light. When I went in, they went." The room was disordered, the wardrobe half open, a bag on the floor with its contents half out. Hugo Crane was sitting on the edge of his bed in his clothes with a hand over his left eye. A red mark extended from his temple down to his cheekbone. "Someone hit me," he said. His voice was entirely steady. "I was at the desk and someone came from behind and hit me. When I came round, they were gone." Miss Marple examined the room carefully while Gerald fussed, and Philip found a cloth for Hugo's face. The wardrobe was disordered but not searched, or rather, it had been searched by someone who knew what they were looking for. The desk drawer was open. A leather document wallet that had presumably been in it was on the floor, empty. Whatever the document was, it was gone. She looked at Hugo Crane's face. The mark was genuine. The steadiness of his voice was also genuine, but it was the steadiness of a man choosing calm rather than a man who is naturally calm. There was a difference. "Did you see who it was?" she asked. "No," he said. "I heard something. I started to turn, then the light went." "You were reading something at the desk." A pause. Just a pause, but she caught it. "Making notes. For tomorrow." Tomorrow was the reading of the will. Everyone in the house was, in their different ways, preparing for tomorrow. "Well," Miss Marple said, "you should have that seen too. Miriam, I believe you mentioned having some arnica in your bag." "That is exactly what we need." She went back to her room and wrote in her notebook and thought about a document wallet that had been empty before it was taken, and a man who was either a victim or performing the appearance of one, and the particular difficulty of knowing which. She thought about it for a long time. Then she decided she was fairly sure, and then she began to think about how to make sure certain. Chapter 8. Sunday morning. Sunday came in clear. The snow had finished in the night, and the sky was the particular flat white of winter that gives everything perfect visibility and no shadow. The lane was still blocked. There was no moving the drift without equipment. But the telephone line was restored by 8 o'clock. Gerald called the police station in Brentford. A sergeant said they would send someone as soon as the county roads were clear, which he estimated at midday. 4 hours. Miss Marple had breakfast early. Alone, in the small dining room. She ate toast and drank tea and thought about the things she needed to confirm before midday. There was a document. Or there had been one, real or staged. The document either implicated someone in something relating to the late Mr. Ashworth's estate, or it was the kind of thing that someone believed existed and would search for. Roger Fell had gone to the library to find something, or to leave something, or both. He had died there, and the method was the wine. She was confident about that now. The wine glass on the desk, the cracked stem. Whoever had come with him to the library, or been waiting inside, had put something into the glass, had watched him drink it, and had gone back out through the French window. 2 sets of prints in the snow, going and returning. One person had stayed by the window, the other had gone in and come back. 2 people. She had been thinking about this since Friday night. 2 people meant a plan. A plan meant discussion, agreed roles, a shared reason. It was not the kill of a single frightened person. It was considered. After breakfast, she went to find Hewson. She found him in the pantry, polishing silver. This was what Hewson did when he was thinking. She had noticed this on Friday evening and filed it away. "Hewson," she said, "I need to ask you something that may seem impertinent." "Yes, Miss Marple." He did not stop polishing. Before Mr. Ashworth died, in his last months, I believe his health was somewhat difficult. He had his good days and his bad days, Hewson said, and during the bad periods, who managed the household accounts? The paperwork? Mr. Gerald, mostly, and occasionally Mr. Crane. He'd been handling some of the estate business for a year or more. The master trusted him. And Mrs. Ashworth. Hewson set down the piece of silver. Mrs. Ashworth. he said carefully, is a very capable woman. She has always known exactly what is happening in this house. He picked up the next piece. Thank you, Miss Marple said. She went to the library. The room had not been properly examined. Gerald had looked in it. Philip had looked in it. But looking is not the same as examining, and she had observed that both of them looked at the floor where Fell had lain, rather than at the desk, rather than at the room itself. The writing desk was old, mahogany, with a leather surface and 3 drawers on the right. The center drawer was unlocked and empty except for writing paper. The top right drawer held correspondence, sorted and folded, 2 or 3 years' worth. The bottom right drawer was locked. She looked at the lock. Then she looked at the keyhole. Then she looked around the room. On the mantelpiece, behind the clock, was a small brass letter opener. She took it to the drawer and worked at it for 2 minutes in the way that Mrs. Hartnell's youngest had taught her without meaning to, during an ill-advised summer in 1947. The lock gave, inside, a folder. Inside the folder, a letter on Ashworth Hall, writing paper, dated 14 months ago. 3 paragraphs, 2 signatures. She read it twice. Then she put it back, closed the drawer, replaced the letter opener, and went to make a phone call. Chapter 9. The Arrangement. She had 1 telephone call to make before the police arrived, and she made it from the small sitting room with the door closed. She rang a number in London that was answered by a young man who said the office was closed on Sundays. She gave her name. After a pause, he put her through to an older man who said, with some caution, that he remembered her from the vicarage matter 3 years ago and would be happy to assist if he could. She asked him to look up 2 things. She gave him the name of a company and the name of a man. She asked whether, to his knowledge, there was a document in existence that transferred partial ownership of a property called Ashworth Hall to that man, witnessed and signed by the late Mr. Richard Ashworth, and whether that transfer had been registered anywhere. She listened for 3 minutes. She said, "Thank you very much." She rang off. Then she sat in the small sitting room with her knitting and thought about a thing that had happened in St. Mary Mead 8 years ago. Colonel Appleton had been a very kind man, and his sister had been a very practical one, and between them they had managed his affairs for 30 years without any difficulty. The difficulty had come when the colonel began to be forgetful, and his sister, finding herself with a power of attorney she had never expected to use, had quietly arranged several things that the colonel, in full health, would never have agreed to. She had done it out of love, in her own way. That was the terrible part. She had genuinely believed she was protecting him. Miss Marple thought about Constance Ashworth, 61, thin, precise, the kind of woman who knows exactly what is happening in her house. Who had managed the household accounts when her husband was ill? Who had sent Hewson to lock the library at 11, but did not ask where the key was kept, because she already knew? Who slept in the east wing this winter, 40 yards from a French window? She thought about Hugo Crane, in business with the Ashworths for 15 years, trusted. Who had something in a document wallet in his room that was either valuable or designed to appear so? Who had received a bruise on his face Saturday night from a hand he said he did not see? She thought about the second set of footprints, lighter, smaller. She thought about the wine glass, cracked at the stem, not broken, not shattered, caught and set down carefully. By someone for whom that small act of care was instinctive, even in a moment that required no care at all. She thought about what she had read in the locked drawer. The letter was not what Philip believed it to be. It was not a fraudulent transfer. It was a confession, of sorts. A record of monies paid by Hugo Crane to Gerald Ashworth over a period of 18 months in exchange for information about the estate that Crane used to undercut 2 competing bids on adjacent land. Gerald had known and been paid. The old Mr. Ashworth had not known. Roger Fell had known. He had held the letter. He had come this weekend to give it to Philip, as he had said in the hall on Friday evening, because Philip was the one who would act on it. And he had been killed before he could. The question was who had killed him. The question was whether it had been Gerald Ashworth protecting himself, or Hugo Crane protecting himself, or both of them, which was the answer that the two sets of footprints suggested and which made everything considerably worse. She heard the drawing-room clock strike 11. 1 hour. She put down her knitting and went to find Diana Fellows. Chapter 10. The Trap. Miss Marple found Diana in the morning room, alone with a cup of cold coffee and the document wallet that should have been taken from Hugo Crane's room. It was on the table in front of her, and it was not empty. "You took it," Miss Marple said. Diana did not deny it. "I heard Hugo going to his room on Friday night. I heard him again on Saturday morning. He was looking for something. I knew if he found it first, it would disappear." She looked at the wallet. "I went in while he was at dinner on Saturday. I took it, and then someone else went to his room Saturday night and hit him." "Yes, I didn't do that." Diana met her eyes. "I didn't know they would do that. I didn't know anyone else was looking." "What is in the wallet?" Diana opened it. Inside were 3 things: a land registry document, a set of transfer papers for a subsidiary company, and a personal note in a handwriting Miss Marple recognized from the letter in the locked drawer. The note was in Gerald Ashworth's hand. It was brief and straightforward, a record of what had been paid, and to whom, and when. "Gerald and Hugo together," Diana said. "For 18 months. The old man didn't know." "No. And Roger Fell did know, because the old Mr. Ashworth told him. In the last weeks, when he was more clear-minded than anyone around him realized. He told Fell, and he asked Fell to make it right after he was gone. And Gerald found out that Fell had been told. Yes, or Hugo did, or both." Miss Marple sat down. "They have been in this together long enough to think alike, long enough to divide a task without discussing it at length. Who goes to the window? Who goes in?" Diana looked at her. "You are going to tell the police." "Yes, when they arrive." She paused. "But I need you to do something first. Both documents, the letter from the locked drawer and what you have there, need to be in safe hands before the police come in. Not in your room, not in mine. I want you to put them in the cook's pantry, behind the second shelf on the right, where Mrs. Partridge keeps the tin of barley. Nobody in this house has any reason to go there. Behind the—" Diana blinked. "The most secure location in any house," Miss Marple said, "is the place the inhabitants consider too ordinary to search." She sent Diana to the kitchen with a request to Mrs. Partridge for a small pot of the excellent barley soup from last night, if there happened to be any remaining. Then she went to find Gerald Ashworth. She found him in the study, standing at the window looking at the snow-covered lane. She heard a car in the distance, engine carrying on the cold air. And by the way Gerald's shoulders changed, he heard it too. "The police!" he said without turning. "I expect so," Miss Marple said. She stood beside him and also looked at the lane. They were quiet for a moment. "You seem like a perceptive woman," Gerald said. "So I am told," she said. "Then you already know." "I know a good deal," she said. "The police will know the rest shortly. The documents are safe." She paused. "I am sorry about your father. He was betrayed by people he trusted, and then betrayed again by his own son in the years when he was least able to protect himself. That is a very particular grief." Gerald said nothing. "And I am sorry that you chose what you chose on Friday night. Fear makes very swift decisions, and very permanent ones." She left him at the window and went to the hall in time to see, through the glass panel of the front door, a police car making its way up the lane at a careful 15 miles an hour, snow chains on the rear wheels. Behind it, a second car. Hewson opened the door before they knocked. The cold came in. Chapter 11. The Arrest. Detective Inspector Marsh was 43, with the solidly built manner of a man who preferred facts to speculation, and who had driven through 3 miles of iced B roads to get here. He stood in the drawing room and listened to Miss Marple for 4 minutes without interrupting, which told her a good deal about his intelligence. Then he went and spoke to his sergeant. Then he made 2 calls from the telephone in the hall. Then he came back. "The documents," he said. Diana produced them from her coat pocket. Marsh looked at her and then at the coat pocket and decided not to ask. He read. His face did nothing in particular, which was professional. He interviewed Gerald first, in the study, with the door closed. The interview lasted 40 minutes. When Gerald came out, his face was altered. Not collapsed, not broken, but changed in some final way, the way a thing changes when it has been decided. He sat in the drawing room and did not look at Hugo Crane. Hugo was interviewed second. He lasted 25 minutes before his solicitor was demanded. Marsh said he was perfectly entitled to wait for a solicitor, which would of course mean going to the station, which would of course mean Hugo did not wait for a solicitor. At 2:15 in the afternoon, Marsh arrested both Gerald Ashworth and Hugo Crane on suspicion of the murder of Roger Fell. He did it quietly, with the plain competence of a man who has done this before in rooms that were not prepared for it. Hugo went with the uniform officer without speaking. Gerald paused at the drawing-room door. His mother was in her chair by the window, perfectly upright, her hands in her lap. They looked at each other. She did not speak. He did not speak. He went. Marsh stayed another hour, taking statements from the others, examining the library, arranging for the body to be removed when the road was properly clear. He spoke briefly to Miss Marple and thanked her, without elaborating on what he was thanking her for, which she preferred. "The documents confirmed it," he said. "The motive was there from the beginning." "Yes," she said. "Money usually is." "You found the letter in the locked drawer." "I did." She did not say how. "I made some inquiries this morning by telephone. The transfer of funds was real. The land purchase was real. And Mr. Fell's knowledge of it was real, which was why he could not be allowed to speak on Sunday morning when the will was read." "They must have decided at dinner Friday," Marsh said. "Yes, or before. The plan required 2 people. That suggests it was not entirely spontaneous." She paused. The wine glass on the desk had been refilled after dinner. Someone had brought something to the library or added something in the hall before Mr. Fell took his glass. "I believe the post-mortem will find something that should not be there." "Shouldn't take long," Marsh said. He thanked her again and went to speak to his sergeant. Philip Ashworth appeared at Miss Marple's elbow with 2 cups of tea. He had been standing in the hall during the arrests, and he looked like a man who has just watched something large and irrevocable happen. "I thought he was better than that," Philip said. "Gerald, I thought he was frightened," Miss Marple said. "Frightened men do things that calm men would not. That's meant to make it make sense." "No," she said. "It's meant to explain it. Those are different things." Philip drank his tea. Outside, the police car pulled slowly away down the lane, chains grinding the packed snow. The second car followed. The house, suddenly, was very quiet. Chapter 12. Monday morning. The lane was clear by Monday morning. Someone from the village had come with a tractor at first light, and by 8 o'clock the drift was gone, and the surface below it was only slightly treacherous and perfectly navigable if you were careful. The cars left in a line, the way they had arrived on Friday, but not the same cars. Miriam left first, before 9. She had a bag and a quiet face, and the particular composure of a woman who has been waiting for something to be decided for a long time and has finally had it decided. She shook Constance's hand at the door. She said nothing else. She did not look back at the house. Diana Fellows left at 9:30, with the documents in her briefcase and a list of calls to make. She kissed Miss Marple on the cheek and said, which she did not need to say but said anyway, "None of this was your fault." "Nor yours," Miss Marple said. Philip was the last of the guests. He came down at 10 with his 2 poorly packed bags and stood in the hall looking at the silver letter tray and the barometer and the portrait of his grandfather that had been there since before he was born. "What happens to the house?" he asked. "That will depend on the will," Miss Marple said. "And on what your mother decides. She won't sell." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "I don't think she will." He nodded. At the door he paused. "The light in the empty cottage," he said. "In the east wing. Roger Fell saw it from his window on Friday night. That's what made him suspicious. He mentioned it to me in the hall. He said, 'There's a light in the window and no one should be in there.' He thought it was odd. He looked at the door. That's what made him decide to go to the library that night, because he'd been meant to come to me in the morning, but the light made him nervous. He went early." Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. "He went early," she said, "and they were ready. They were ready because he was predictable. He was the kind of man who acts when he's anxious." Philip picked up his bags. "I keep thinking about whether, if he'd just waited, he might have," she said. "Or they might have found another moment. Once a plan like this exists, it tends to find its way to completion. I have found that in my experience." He said goodbye and went down the steps and put his bags in the hire car. Miss Marple stood in the hall while Hewson closed the door. The house was quiet. The fire in the drawing room had burned low. The silver needed polishing. Somewhere at the back, Mrs. Partridge was beginning breakfast for two. Constance Ashworth came out of the drawing room in her dressing gown, which Miss Marple had never seen her wear, and which was dark green wool and very fine. "Will you have some toast?" Constance said. "I would," Miss Marple said. "Thank you." They went to the small dining room and sat at the table where 9 people had sat on Friday night, and 8 on Saturday, and where now there were 2. The light came in from the east across the snow and lay in long, pale rectangles on the tablecloth. Constance poured. She did not mention her son. She did not mention any of it. She said, "The Regency windows in the library. They are terrible in January. I've been meaning to have them seen to." "You should," Miss Marple said. "The damp does get into the frames eventually." "I know." Constance looked at her tea. "My husband loved that room. He would sit there for hours, even in January, even with the drafts." "It is a beautiful room," Miss Marple said. Outside, the snow was melting, very slowly, in the morning sun. Water ran along the gutters of Ashworth Hall and dripped from the eaves in a long, patient line. The light burned quietly in the library windows, as it had always done, as it would do again.